This Anzac Day marks 30 years since one of the largest peacekeeping operations in our Defence Force history, a dangerous and difficult mission in Somalia. The Governor-General David Hurley commanded the 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment during Operation Solace in Somalia in 1993. For his reflections on that service, I sat down with the Governor-General at Government House in Canberra.
And approaching now is Australian Defence Force Somalia, with 450 veterans marching today. And leading the march is the Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia, His Excellency, General the Honourable David Hurley, who commanded the 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment during Operation Solace in 1993.
Governor-General David Hurley, thanks for your time. Somalia was the first battalion deployed since Vietnam. Why was it so important to you personally and the ADF?
Well, we'd been through 15 years of what soldiers now refer to as the Great Peace, between the end of the Vietnam War and Somalia, and Cambodia just starting that operation with the UN at the same time, but Cambodia was a contingent, not a battalion group. So being the 1st battalion to leave the country in 15 years, a lot of eyes were on us, but we felt the pride in that as well, that we were going off to represent our country, represent our army overseas for the first time for a long time. So it was, in many levels, it was important to us.
And I was reading some of the comments made by some of your diggers in that deployment. They've been in Canberra for a reunion and marching on Anzac Day. The view was that they thought they might not go anywhere because of that peace dividend out of the Cold War. Did that involve a mindset shift for you as one of the commanding officers?
Well, it did, in the sense that this was now reality. I mean, we did a lot of training in that period, and we were fortunate that just prior to the deployment being announced, or commitment being announced, we were training to do evacuations offshore. So we had a mentality at the time that, yes, we would or could be sent offshore to do things. We didn't think Africa, though. I mean, Africa was not anywhere on our scope at the time. So it did. I mean, it was a sort of jolt of reality. Oh, we're actually going. And on many of the phone calls that were made to people to recall them just before Christmas, people were saying, "Oh, this is a joke, isn't it?" sort of thing. We're not going anyway. So yes, it did take time to get people to turn around and say, "No, this is for real. We're off."
And give our audience a sense, if you can, Governor-General, of how tense it was, because it was not just a time of conflict, but a time of famine, and you and your soldiers often had to guard food and water.
Our job was to create a secure environment for the NGOs, the charitable organisations that were providing food, and the World Food Organisation, to help them deliver the food into regions which were still being contested. I mean, when we arrived, Badao was known as the City of Death, publicly, internationally. So every morning there would be bodies laid out. People would bring out people who died of starvation overnight would be laid out, and people were living in sort of little huts that made of sticks and whatever material they could to cover over, and they just died inside there and were taken out. So, I mean, some of the sites were very unpleasant. And so our job was to help clean up the streets in the sense of keeping people with weapons off the street, and then escorting the NGOs out to each of the villages to try to deliver food. And we were successful in doing that, so we did the job we were asked to do. But I think many of those early sites were bodies that, buried in the river line. We had to help move those because that was polluting water when it came and so forth. So there were some very many unpleasant tasks we were asked to do.
It was also ended up being a blueprint, didn't it? And as you reflect, not just as Governor-General, but a former CDF, Chief of Defence, it provided a blueprint, didn't it, for subsequent peacekeeping and stabilisation missions, not the least of which East Timor.
Well, we did test our doctrine, and we found that we although we trained a lot in Australia and we were deployed long distances in Australia, we hadn't really set ourselves up properly logistically to support an operation that distance away from Australia. And just testing our doctrine in peacekeeping, what we had to change, what we could keep. So I think, yes, in terms of if you look at that 10-year period leading up to 99, when we went into East Timor, there were a lot of lessons we learnt out of that. And many of the people who served in my battalion then, or in the other organisations that were in Somalia, were in senior positions by the time we went into Timor.
I mentioned earlier, but the veterans, there's a reunion, they're going to be marching, the Somalia veterans with you. You're going to be marching alongside them, the ADF veterans that served there 30 years ago. There's an exhibition on at the memorial. The government's also accepted the recommendations of the Defence Honours and Awards Tribunal for a citation. Mm-hmm. How important is this to recognise and remember this particular operation?
Look, I think to many of the soldiers, sailors and others who participated, that recognition from the tribunal is important. It's not 100% of people who went there, but for the majority it is. I think that will reinforce them the value of what they did, because often there are questions in people's mind, we could have done more, and we had assets to do this and so forth. So I think that will say to them, Australia values what you did, and thank you very much. And we honour you for it. And I think in terms of well-being, that will be very important to many people. Marching together, that's always a great, just a great day, because you catch up with friends and see people haven't seen for a while, and tell stories about how good we were and all those sorts of things. Remind ourselves of what we were like when we were young. But so the camaraderie and the friendship that comes out of that is important. A big opportunity on this occasion to thank families who are left when people deploy, and that goes throughout the entire run from the early 90s to now. So again, there's just so many layers that you peel back on these events. They're just not as simple as marching on a day, and there's so much more to it.
It has that flow-on effect, and I'm glad you mentioned the family, because I read your letters that you wrote to your family during the deployment to Somalia, and it gives your words and your message to a very young family. One of your children just learning toilet training, and another...
That was my responsibility, and I sort of left my wife to do it. So.
Yeah, and another with no teeth, having yes. the baby teeth all falling out. I guess it's a reminder of the moments that diggers miss. It's a big sacrifice in that sense.
It is. I mean, you are away from family, and of course in those days, we were talking 30 years ago, there was no internet, there was no instant communication. I mean, we didn't receive mail for 6 weeks. I mean, if that happened today, there'd be an uproar. We had no electronic communication until we got our HF radios linked into the old telecom post in Perth, and were able to link in through that, and then finally through Fort Huachuca in the US to do old STD calls back to Australia. And that took quite a while. So families were left to fend for themselves. So forming the wives clubs, getting newsletters out, socialising, get kids together and so forth was really important work, and they did a brilliant job at it.
But you were pretty disciplined in terms of the regularity of... You didn't let many weeks go by before you sent letters home.
Oh, I was on strict instructions, Kieran.
Yeah.
Yes, but no, it is important. I think it's also a relief when you sit down, because it just takes your mind off the job for a while you sit down and think about family and trying to draw pictures of donkeys and all those sorts of things so the kids would get an idea of what was going on. But no, I think it's important. It was an important relief to be able to just have that bit of private time and do those sort of things.
And as someone who served over a long period of time, it's interesting we think about that lack of technology back 30 years ago, but then as CDF you oversaw the arrival of some incredible technologies. We think of the Joint Strike Fighter, for example. There was a huge change, wasn't there, in that 30 years in more ways than one?
Oh, it was chalk and cheese. If you look at the equipment we took with us back in the early 90s compared to what we put soldiers in today, it's just staggering. It's almost sci-fi from then to now. You would think, oh, well, we're going to look like that in the future, have that amount of equipment. I mean, we had one night sight, essentially, per section, if we were lucky. Today, every soldier carries it. So in the sense of senses, the way you would do business differently, it's just chalk and cheese. Mm. Yeah.
Just finally, this Anzac Day, I know there've been various stories, ongoing issues out of Afghanistan and so on. Not the easiest of time for many veterans. What's your message to members of the ADF more broadly, as Governor General and a former Chief of Defence, in terms of this Anzac Day?
I tell them to be very proud in their uniform, be very proud in the history and the legacy that they've been handed down, and I'll talk to that in my address on Anzac Day at the War Memorial. The ADF, I think, has served Australia brilliantly over decades, over a century, in its various forms, various names. And we have families, people who are deeply committed to service to the country. They should be proud of it.
All Australians own and are part of the same legacy, the Anzac legacy, lest we forget.
Governor General David Hurley, I appreciate your time on this important Anzac Day. Thanks.
Kieran, thank you very much.